Let's try this. It is Wednesday morning, February 20th. We are looking at, by our numbering system, Pirkei Avot 3:17. You have that look like you don't have a copy of it.
I thought that there was no class. I thought I was coming to bake, so I didn't bring my iPad.
Well, I can give you an analog copy.
Thank you.
You know what? I'm going to grab. I don't have a pencil. Sorry. Remember that the numbering systems are different, and all of them through 3:18 are up online on the Ohr Shalom website. And the end of chapter 3 is 3:19 by our numbering system, and that one is out. It's not up on the website, but please add there, it'll be up on the website today. And so the end of the third chapter, which will mark halfway through.
And remind us on the website means...
If you go to the education tab, I think,
okay.
And if you go down, it says Pirkei Avot.
Thank you.
And that takes you to a very simple page that our webmaster has grand designs for making it a much cooler page. In the meantime, I have what I need to keep it up to date. So he can make it cool, I'm going to make it functional. We are videotaping, and so you can listen to it. I don't think I've uploaded the one Pirkei Avot that we recorded yet, but I've uploaded the first two from Ezra Nehemiah. Though, side note, I noticed that when I transfer the files from this to my computer this morning, that it inverted the video. So I have to go on YouTube and see if I spend an hour upside down on Ezra Nehemiah. So if I do, tough, deal with it. You stand on your head. I don't know. Somehow something flips. All right, Pirkei Avot 3:17. Let's read the Hebrew together. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah Omer, Im ein Torah, ein derech eretz. Im ein derech eretz, ein Torah. Im ein chokhmah, ein yira. Im ein yira, ein chokhmah. Im ein bina, ein da'at. Im ein da'at, ein bina. Im ein kemach, ein Torah. Im ein Torah, ein kemach. And according to my notes, we'd gotten halfway through. We had gotten through a discussion about if there's no wisdom, there is no awe or fear. And if there is no awe or fear, there is no wisdom. Anybody want to catch us up on a little bit of the conversation from 2 weeks ago, or a thought that you've had since then before we push forward?
I said the whole concept is that the circle.
Okay, so that the whole concept is one big circle in terms of its interreliance.
And that's it. It's interrelated. The fact that it says an end in that and that. But then it says an into that, and it's also system, and that system is interrelated. It's
good.
It's not separate.
Good. It's all interconnected into it. I don't have another 3:16, so it's what we had last time. So, sit next to somebody who's willing to share with you. I didn't realize that whoever figured out the coffee. Thank you, Jackie. Did you figure it out, or Suzanne did? Good. Thank you. Because Louise was willing to when I was pessimistic. Told her she wouldn't be able to. What's that? All right. So the interdependence. So dualistic thinking, but here it's not dualistic thinking, it's exclusive. It's not A or B and no option. It's A only if B and B only if A. It's the mutual dependency thinking, which is a lot of stuff about mutual dependent dualisms. You can think yin-yang, male-female, the push-me-pull-me stuff. It's really fun. There's an argument amongst circle drawers between centripetal force and centrifugal force, right? Because for a circle to work, moving along the tangent of a circle, moving along the tangent of the circle, you have acceleration outward, that's centrifugal force, but you also have the force inward, which is centripetal force, and it's the balancing of those two forces, which is why, whatever it is that's drawing your circle moves in an arc. Because it's got something pulling it out, something pulling it in, and it moves perpendicular to centrifugal and centripetal force. So circle people, circle drawers, Honi. mystic from the Talmud, has what to say about the push me, pull me, and the inability for life. You know, we have it oxygen, carbon dioxide. We have it photosynthesis and respiration. We have it boys and girls. We have lots of them. But here we have the first two that we looked at were Torah and Derech Eretz, and Yira and Chochma. Now, moving on. Im ein bina ein da'at, im ein da'at ein bina. If there is no bina, an intellectual condition or an intellectual practice that we would call understanding, we're on 17 now. If there's no understanding, there is no knowledge. And if there is no knowledge, then there is no understanding. So what does that mean?
If you want to learn something,
if you want to learn something,
you have to understand it.
Good, if you want to understand it. So when you use learn as a verb there, what do you mean by to learn something?
Let's say we are learning to say a verb. That is there with the session, so we should understand it. And that we will not learn it. It's
Good.
here, and then it says after, nothing happens.
Good. So your definition of learning is some kind of composite experience that includes understanding, but includes retention, right? That's what it's not just to hear something. But what's the distinction between understanding and knowledge?
Can you please go back to Hebrew? I have no idea which one is what in your language. Yes.
So bina, good. Bina is traditionally translated as to understand, and da'at is translated as to know, or as the verb. Okay, but here is stated knowledge and understanding. So what is the distinction, or what is one or the other? I saw your mouth moving first, but I saw Ruben's hand first. Nothing came up.
I think knowledge is, I can recite all sorts of stuff to you. I can tell you, the dates of various wars or whatever else. I can't actually, but let's assume I could. Versus understanding, which is understanding all of the events and causes that went into that
Good.
war.
So, Ruben?
Well, these two elements has another thing common to this one. This is the purpose of learning.
Okay.
If I want to learn, this is very important, that I am interested in learning,
Okay.
so I will have
Bless you.
to understand what I am learning. So the knowledge is when I learn and I know.
Good.
I understand and I know what is it. But for me the most important thing is the purpose. Because in the university it's the same. I mean, it's not to read. It's what are your intentions to apply that you are learning.
Good. So
For
with
me,
the
most
intention
important thing.
and a sense of being able to apply it. Two different sets of understanding and knowledge. Knowledge for me are factoids, data, right? There is a detail, that's a speck of knowledge. I know that 2 + 2 = 4. I know that July 4th, 1776. I know that...
A squared plus B squared equals C squared.
Say again?
A squared plus B squared equals
A
C
squared plus B squared equals C squared, if instead of being a circle, which was where we started, if you want to be a right triangle. So that's knowledge. To know something is to have a detail, yeah?
I want to ask, when did this term da'at change from biblical to Talmudic Hebrew to mean slightly different? It's a da'at tovara.
Oh, so...
Definitely not just knowledge, but understanding.
Neat. It's a complicated, even biblically, I wouldn't translate...
That's why I'm not so comfortable
with the distinction.
The distinction definitely means a lot, because here it's either, without this, but da'at is translated simply as learning or knowledge is, I think, doing it somewhat a disservice.
Well, and I'll make it even more complicated with my second definition of this pairing. I'm comfortable in the rabbinic world feeling like I know more than looking at the diversity of uses in the biblical world.
Okay.
And remember, in the biblical world, we're looking at usages that could span up to 1,000 years.
Okay.
Anyway, so the one pair is da'at as factoid, as a body, like we say, a body of knowledge, something you could put in. And understanding then is some kind of analysis based on that knowledge, but not limited by that knowledge. So you can say a squared plus b squared equals c squared, but to understand, perhaps, would be to go through the proof about why that's true. And if you could demonstrate through a mathematical proof why that's true, then clearly you understand it, as opposed to, and maybe even simple problem solving is some level of understanding, though not as deep, as opposed to simply knowing that it's true. I know that it's true, that if you square each side, it equals the square of the hypotenuse. So that's one pairing. I'm going to give you a second one in a second.
And
I'll give you the second one in a second. I won't forget it. Analysis. No. Correct. So the knowledge is related to the understanding, right? And in that sense, it makes sense. If you don't have knowledge, you can't understand something, right? What isn't necessarily totally clear for the first one, and to think about, not to answer yet, why is understanding necessary for knowledge? So I'm going to hold that open, sort of in abeyance. I'm not going to address it. The second way to do it, and this is really fun to play with biblically also, is knowledge is also know-how. Okay? So it's not just to know a thing that is knowable, but it's know-how. So for example, skills. So for example, if I gave you a screw and a screwdriver, and maybe a drill start in a wall, if you knew how to use a screwdriver, you could screw it in. But what's really, really fun are people who don't understand how screws work. Right? I love that stuff because the principle of a screw is applied in all sorts of places. You can draw water. Right? There are water screws. They're the same principle as a screw. And I love, just on a level, the difference between a nail and a screw. Because many carpenters, many people who use this stuff have a much better awareness of when's the right time to grab a hammer and a nail and when's the right time to grab a screwdriver and a screw than I do, but without really thinking about how they work. And why is it that you hit a hammer on the head and you turn a screw, go back to, you apply force to the screw, but the screw moves perpendicular to the force you apply. That's really a funky thing. But many people have the knowledge of how to, even when to, use these tools, but not the understanding of why is it when I turn the screw this way, it goes into the wall. I get it with a hammer. It doesn't take deep understanding to understand. It's like whack-a-mole. I get that.
It's a lot like how computers. We know
Outstanding.
software, but we don't understand.
Outstanding. We know how to make beautiful, beautiful documents using Word, right? We know how to use the internet. We know that we can instant message, lickety-split with somebody in Israel, right? And it works, and we can even Skype with them, but we don't understand how it works. Very few of, maybe you do. Very few of us understand how it works. David Ellenson, one of the finest teachers with whom I've ever studied, when he talks about the modern mind, I really understand the modern mind and its break from the medieval mind, which I love the distinction. The modern mind believes that everything is understandable. He says, it doesn't mean that I understand anything. He says, I don't know anything about the internal combustion engine, but I get in my car and I turn the key and it works. And I know that there are people who understand it and understand how to fix it and so forth, but I'm not one of them, but it's knowable. Same thing when we talk about medical health, right? There are doctors and there are researchers who are trying to help us understand more and more. And, if I'd wanted to do that or whatever, but I'm not one of them. The medieval mind, and if you imagine if you could pull somebody out of the 10th century, or if you could go to some tiny South Pacific island or whatever else, and even strike a match, you don't even have to turn on your car and drive 80 miles per hour to really impress them. They can't, it's not understandable in a scientific way to them. It's some kind of cool magic or reflection of a deity or whatever it is. But it's not understandable in a way that we use the term. Anyway, so the two sets being knowledge, being factoids in the understanding or analysis of those individual datum, or having to do with skills, and as opposed to the understanding of what's being done. So I would offer those as as the best that I could do for the two understandings here. If we wanted to, be happy to, it's not till September that we read Parshat Bereshit again, which is where Da'at really becomes a really neat question to try and understand, and it's really fun because you have this play from the Da'at reflected in the fruit of the certain tree and the Arum reflected in that way in the serpent, and then punned off of their lack of clothing. That becomes an interesting one, but that's there. Okay, Jessica.
So, Ruthie, may I ask, do we use da'at now in modern Hebrew?
Oh, yeah.
So, and how does it translate, roughly?
Whoever has more fix, there is about 3 lines of different terms for how da'at is translated. Beginning with wisdom, intelligence, knowledge.
All of them. Correct.
Understanding, that depending on the context, and it's so many different meanings today.
Correct.
So if you were speaking to a student and I was asking, do you understand what I've just said to you? Do you understand?
You would use bina.
You'd use bina.
If you understand, would be mevin.
When somebody wants to draw a distinction, I find the terms are easiest when they're used. And here 2 are used as foils to each other, and chokhmah is in the previous one, so we have all 3 of them as the most common verbs. Not the verbs, most common words that are used in that space. There are others there as well that really make it confusing if we want to put haskel in there, and if we put lamad in there, which is different. But when they're used in conjunction, I find them easier. When somebody throws out one word, right? So if you're specifically looking at a student and asking the question, do you understand something? It's a pretty easy one, right? And you would ask somebody, do you know the question, do you know the answer, is a different question than do you understand the answer.
It's 2 different answers.
Right? 2 different questions.
Yodea would be the same shorosh as that.
Right. So it works there.
Yodea, know, and mevin, understand.
Right.
Exactly those
Correct.
same shoroshim.
And on a simple level, to be overly simplistic, da'at is something that you can recall, use your recall to come up with. And bina is something that is not just recall. Multiple choice versus short answer question.
That's why the second part is much more
Good. So now that I've done it, it seems clear why you can't have understanding without knowledge, because what are you understanding? It's like, how do you build a brick house without bricks? Mm-hmm. Right? But you could have bricks without a brick house. So why perhaps can't you have knowledge? I'm sorry. Why perhaps can't you have... I'm confusing myself.
Knowledge without
Why couldn't you have knowledge with no understanding?
Yeah.
Thank you. That was harder than it needed to be.
Okay, so I have a really good example that came up yesterday that I was going to share with you, and I don't have my thing to make a quote, but I have a friend from high school who posted a thing from a student. She teaches 12th grade calculus, and he said she reposted something. He had taken her class 15 years ago, and his statement to her was, for all those 12th grade students that you now have who say there will be no use for this function in my life, I'm going to learn it because I want to pass the test. I have used it today.
Nice.
In my work.
But it wasn't about geometry. No, I'm sorry.
It was about calculus. It was about calculus. So, but for all those, so even though, so he had that knowledge, like he learned the function, but could see no use. So until he could see use, the knowledge was not worth anything to him.
Nice.
That's brilliant.
Ruben?
There's another common one related with this. For instance, in Talmud, I remember that. Now I am studying Talmud. In Talmud, what is the problem? The logic is completely different to learn. Because when you learn, you have facts, and you are putting all the facts, and you get a conclusion at the end. And in Talmud is different. It doesn't work this way. So even you have knowledge of you have to know how to learn this in order to understand.
Okay.
And this is very difficult if you don't know this. For instance, in school, you are learning about the things. I remember in mathematics, I learned all the methods, but the things how to apply them.
All right, but I still want to ask the question. Because even your comment, I learned the formulas, I memorized the equations, I have knowledge. Why might it be that Rabbi Elazar argues that you can't have knowledge without understanding? Because we would generally say you can. I can get you to memorize July 4th, 1776 without understanding even simply what it means, let alone deeply what did it really mean and so forth.
Or decoding a language, decoding Hebrew. There are many people who can read
the knowledge to read Hebrew.
Don't have a clue what they're reading.
Correct. Which is fun because I can read French and German and Italian and a whole bunch of other languages. Right. So in the way we use the terms, I would say that most of us, or the way we kind of come to this range of meaning, most of us would say you can have knowledge without understanding. Now, it's obviously better to have both. And it makes sense that you can't have understanding without knowledge, because you have to have something to understand.
That's not true.
Okay?
What's not true?
You
Which
can
part of
understand.
Well, the consensus is true, but...
You can understand a foreign language, and you can speak it, but that doesn't mean that you
know it
when you see it.
Well, wait. So you may know it by the hearing, but not know it by the seeing, which is a wonderful little allusion to Job, by the way. Now that I have Job on my mind, a reversal of it. But if you
just got
no,
saying
I'm going to just disagree with it. You may
and not know
correct.
What you're reading,
you might have
hear it and
you
not
might
know
have
what you're hearing.
you might have oral knowledge and understanding, but not have literacy, not have the ability to read it. I know a whole lot of people who, in terms of their ears and mouth, exactly, every 3-year-old. Thank you. My Yael, I don't have to go to a foreign language.
A lot of people.
No, I don't think so.
Languages
No, I think the difference is between a spoken and the other side of it is I have pretty good knowledge and understanding of written Aramaic, but I can't speak it. But those are just different things between oral and written as it relates to skills and understanding and so forth. So I don't think that's an exception. I want to come back to my question, though. My question is, what would be an example, or how might we understand? Well, again, I'll take a step backwards. I made the statement, and I think that almost everybody, maybe everybody will agree with me, that the way we use the terms, you could have knowledge without understanding, right?
Yeah, that's easy.
But so let's try and unpack it. Why are these mutually codependent? Why might Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah be saying you can't have knowledge without understanding? Okay, that's the question. When we get Koba and then Suzanne, because I haven't heard Koba's voice yet. Oh, one second, we need Koba first. Go ahead.
Go ahead. Oh,
I find it. Suzanne?
Essence that learning something involves an assumption.
An assumption?
No, understanding.
Oh, understanding.
Knowing something involves understanding.
Outstanding. Outstanding. The knowledge itself, as much as we can use the terms and say that the knowledge is a discrete factoid, and you could just learn the thing. My dad used to have a parrot. I almost said I could teach a parrot. I couldn't teach him anything. But this was a pretty bright Amazon parrot. It was a green something or other. This parrot had a pretty good vocabulary, and I think it had a sense of humor. You'd have to ask a zoologist to pair parrots together, because he knew when to say things to get a response other than just a sunflower seed. And I think he liked seeing people laugh, or he liked the attention about it, which is what a comedy is based on, how to get a reaction out of people. But he had a pretty extensive... I don't think he understood the words. I'm pretty confident. I mean, he had a bird brain, just to, not as an insult. He had a bird brain by definition. I don't think he had any level of understanding. So did he have knowledge, or did he have the ability to mimic things? So when we sort of draw these as being truly isolatable, a factoid, on July 4th, 1776, right, the Declaration of Independence was signed. Factoid. So whatever the factoid is.
Stay with A squared plus B squared equals C squared.
That's the point I wanted to bring up.
All right.
That's the point I wanted to bring up, was the fact that the facts on their own, without the understanding, could possibly be wrong.
Well, so wait, even with understanding, facts can be wrong. That I don't have a problem with. But that there's no fact without the understanding that's implicit in the fact. Think about, that this is a tangelo, right? That's what you called it, Sharon? I would call it an orange, but I would already get corrected again. Without understanding really what that means and how we get to it and the complexity of citrons and whatever else. Think of all the understanding that needs to be present for somebody to teach you a simple fact. Right? Now, you may not have the deep understanding of a botanist or biologist or a chemist or even a painter who understands fruit differently than I do. But think of all the understanding and the associations that go beyond whatever the discrete fact would be. Right? The discrete fact, so somebody gives us a discrete fact, and the fact can't exist in a vacuum. It's connected to other things. It's connected to our understanding, whether it's about history or science, mathematics, whatever it is. So I don't think, and the example of it for me is Pancho. That was my dad's bird's name. That Pancho could quote a fact, could quote a word. In theory, could have been taught July 4th, 1776, though that wasn't in his vocabulary. But he doesn't have any knowledge of that, right? I don't believe. Or the little bit of knowledge he has and a little bit of the understanding are bird-brain knowledge and understanding. It gets him attention, or it gets him a cracker, or it gets whatever it gets. It's not referring to a date that happened 237 years ago like it is for us and so forth. So I don't think we understand in language, we understand in context based on the speaker or the book that we're getting. I don't think there's any way to give somebody a factoid without vast amounts of understanding, even if it's not the interesting deep analysis that we hope comes from that fact. And the proof of it is, children learn to absorb facts, right? But they need language to really make it interesting. And then, the ability to read, or the ability to makes the ability to acquire knowledge much better. But knowledge can't sit without some form of understanding.
Rabbi Eliezer is trying to make sure that these two items don't get separated. He wants to make sure you're not just memorizing the Torah or the Talmud or whatever is being presented. He wants that understanding to be integral to the collection.
So what you're doing is going to make the statement that the Rabbi Elazar is about this as being normative, is being descriptive. It's being normative, not descriptive. That is, what he's doing is he's making a preachy statement that one could actually separate them, but one shouldn't. Right? So that's one way to read it. It's not the way that I read it, but one way to read it is he is teaching you, don't ever separate knowledge from understanding, for all sorts of reasons that we could defend. But based on the way we read the other ones, that is normative. That becomes a thou shalt. Thou shalt not do it this way, or thou shalt do it this way. Descriptive is a statement of what is. So I want to read Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah here as a descriptive. That is, it's not that you could but shouldn't. I want to read him to say it can't be done. Not that you can't, because you're my student and I won't let you. But it can't be done. And anybody who claims to have knowledge. So, but that's a distinction between the way that we're reading it. I don't know that I'm right, but I'm telling you, I want to read it as I've read the other pieces as descriptive. It can't be. Right? Now, it'll be really fun when we get to the last one, because the last one is fundamentally different than the first two. Sharon?
Well, then it must be in the way we're defining the words that it isn't working right.
It must be what's not working right.
Well, the reason we're having difficulty is that we're not defining the words in the way he wants us to define them. If we're having trouble.
Well, again, we have trouble even when we get the things. That's sort of what we've been doing for a couple of years in this class, is having trouble. But I'm not sure.
Well,
I'm not sure what the trouble is that feels unresolved or not understood.
Knowledge,
again,
in the word knowledge.
So
I'm thinking that maybe when you recite a fact, that isn't real knowledge.
Of course it's knowledge. You know the fact.
Well,
I don't think so. I think you can quote a fact like the parrot, or like my 9-year-old can say a squared plus b squared equals c squared, have no knowledge of right triangles, nor any understanding of how to solve it.
Well, but wait, but here's the and this is where I start outside of Elazar ben Azariah and then I come in, because I believe that people know things that they don't understand.
That's true.
Right? So they have knowledge.
The parrot knew how to respond.
Correct.
But it doesn't mean he knew anything about
correct.
That
It certainly.
was.
I'm gonna play language there. It certainly doesn't mean he understood, right? But I believe that people can't. And here, Koba. Not as an example, but in terms of the difference between descriptive and normative reading of Elazar ben Azariah, I believe that there is knowledge that people hold without understanding about that knowledge. Mm-hmm. So somebody can say that a squared plus b squared equals c squared, and be able to know that relates to the sides of a right triangle, but without knowing how to solve a problem based on it, or without being able to do a proof to it. But look at how much understanding they have. It's just not the interesting understanding, right?
You can teach a 2-year-old to say E equals MC squared.
Correct.
Mm-hmm. What does that mean?
Correct.
What does that mean?
E equals. I mean, knowledge of the fact.
He doesn't know anything.
He doesn't know anything.
Correct.
That's just
So
parroting.
wait, when it's the level of parroting, we may be that we don't call it knowledge. But when it's on a level, look, when children I'm going to look at my school teachers, when children in middle school learn that energy equals, mass times a constant squared, and that constant is the speed of light, right? That's the base level of knowledge for the general theory of relativity. Energy equals mass times a constant squared, and that constant is the speed of light. They don't understand that from kids, but they know they can relate it to Albert Einstein. Now if they can understand what that means about how energy and mass or energy and matter are related, that's a level of understanding. They're not solving quantum mechanics, but that's a level of understanding beyond it. But people can know the datum, the factoid, even without understanding it. But even there, they understand it at least a little bit. And you can't learn that without knowing something about Albert Einstein, without knowing about the development. So that's my point, which is why I want to read this descriptively, not normatively, that you can't. A parrot can parrot something, and a 3-year-old can learn to mimic something, but mimicry is not knowledge. To really knowledge, you may not understand it the way you have to by the end of the semester when you write your essay or to solve problems from it, but you have to have enough understanding that single factoid sits on some other kinds of understandings.
But
otherwise,
there is no knowledge without understanding.
correct.
So
That's my point. But it doesn't mean that you have to understand. Do you want to say that to everybody? No, Louise. I heard your voice.
I can't think of the linguist who says that without language there's no knowledge.
Oh.
And I can't think of his name.
If Bill was here, we would get if we had Bill, we would get a long discourse. I don't know which one it is. There are a couple of famous linguists. But the point I want to make is, students climb a ladder in learning before they specialize, right? And it has moments that are like huge rungs. They learn to read. And their ability to read changes the way they do mathematics. Mathematics goes from being about manipulatables, because you can take a pile of, take 2 pencils and 3 pencils and kids can learn math with things they can manipulate. But when they learn to take, chicken scratch hieroglyphics and interpret meaning from them, then mathematics takes off. Even if they aren't ready for A, B's, and C's in math yet, but when they can use numerals representatively, their math abilities develop. So there are skills that are part of the climb. So in order to understand a squared plus, in order to be able to quote the detail, the factoid, about a right triangle of a squared plus b squared equals c squared, even to be able to say the sum of the squares of the 2 sides is equal to the square of the hypotenuse, right? Use the cool vocabulary without... There are all sorts of ways in which somebody with a PhD in mathematics understands that beyond. But other than simple mimicry, a parrot who can mimic back the sounds, to be able to do it even without problem solving may not have the real understanding of that knowledge, but has understanding of all sorts of other things. Language and letters and what is a triangle, right? Maybe, if their knowledge is that much. So that any detail, any factoid, any datum that we would learn, any piece of knowledge We may not have much understanding about that, but we have to have a whole lot of understanding just to be able to acquire that knowledge.
Yeah.
That's what I want to say. All right, Louise and then Copa.
Okay, I'll give you an example of the moment when knowledge changes to understanding.
Okay.
Emily was born on my birthday. Emily, I was like 60 at the time. Okay, and all her life she knew that we had the birthday together. And when she was about 5 years old, she looked at me and said, "How come if we have the same birthday, you're older?" Okay?
And you looked at her and said, "Who told you I was older?"
Yeah, right. But it was like all of a sudden
Click.
the light
Yes.
went on. There was
Yes.
an understanding. She knew what was going on, and she understood age, and she understood numbers, and she understood differences.
And there are a dozen
Birthdays
different
and when you are
directions.
born.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there's a dozen different directions that understanding could go, even from one piece of data, right? Because you can understand it this way, but it's not just competing analysis. You know, it's the difference between understanding the tangelo as a botanist or understanding the tangelo as a painter, right? Both of them understand it just fundamentally through different tools.
Now, what I meant originally was, Eliyahu points out that knowledge and understanding are separable as long when you have knowledge and no understanding. I think he probably meant understanding can't survive without the knowledge. That's the one thing. As a trained historian, I noticed that we picked up a lot of knowledge in our undergraduate work, and then when you moved on to grad school, that's when you picked up an understanding.
Right. Though I think the really neat thing there is when we look backwards at what we learned last year, because it was a 1 year less involved analysis, looks much more like discrete knowledge. And what we're learning now looks to be much more deep analysis. And the hope is when we move on, from middle school to high school, or high school to undergraduate, or undergraduate to graduate work, or graduate work to our postdoc, that not to devalue what we did before, but we gain analytical tools as well as an ever-expanding body of knowledge that allows us to do things that we couldn't have done a year before, or a school before, or whatever else. And that's not always true, but that we have that experience of what it means to, as we grow, to be able to gain more knowledge, more specific tools, and deeper analysis or deeper understanding. And then that becomes the tie, I think, to the third piece, which we were given before, and I don't want to leave Da'at and Bina until we make that connection. Jane.
So that just kind of rang a bell for me. It actually explains for me why I so much enjoyed working for 16 years on a set of concepts and products as opposed to working in different companies with different parts. Because every time I worked with that software and looked at environmental data and stuff like that, each time over the 16 years I go, how did I not know this? How did I not notice this 5 years ago? Mm-hmm. Oh, wow! So, and you can't do that unless you continue that study.
Yeah.
Nice.
And that's real rationale.
Good. And where are we?
Right, exactly.
And how neat in terms of where we're going in a minute
Is
to
there
the
a text
last
in the
one.
class? Yeah.
Right?
Same
That
thing.
look at the things we read over.
Yeah.
I just finished the first 150 pages of my reading marathon in Puerto Vallarta this weekend. I finished completing it's not a Torah cycle, but the second time in my life I read The Hobbit through the Lord of the Rings. It's an accomplishment. It's roughly 1,500 pages. And in between, I saw like 3 different animated versions of The Hobbit over the years, and the 3 movies that most recently make up the film versions of The Lord of the Rings. And man, I absolutely enjoyed reading Tolkien as an adult. I couldn't tell you the last time I read Tolkien, period. In the last some number of months, not all that long. I remember when I started The Hobbit. I read them, and it's fantastic. It just, I'm sure the books haven't changed, Right? So, and I've changed twice. I've changed because I'm not the 13-year-old or whatever age I was when I first read it. And in between, I experienced them through somebody else's medium and somebody else's creation. So I have both my own aging and growing and everything, and the film, the Jackson movies. And it was really, really amazing. And I sort of filed away. I made it as a comment to Jen when I finished it. She wasn't that moved when I finished it. I don't know why. She was engrossed. By the way, because I finished Jubana first, because that's the next readings with the rabbi. And I've been reading The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings in between readings of the rabbi's books each month. I finish the book and then I go on to that. And Jubana is not really what I expected it to be. I mean, when I put it on the list, others have read it and given me some feedback. I loved it, by the way. I'm looking forward to the book discussion. But it's got some wonderful, wonderful stuff that's not usually in readings of the rabbi book. But Jen was reading Jubana, so by the time I finished Lord of the Rings and I was interested in sort of talking some of my own sense of what it was and so forth, she was well into Jubana, and she wanted nothing to do with it, other than my going to get her another drink. She wanted nothing to do with it. All right, but the connection of returning and returning, that the same knowledge is very, very different knowledge and very, very different understanding moving forward. Moving backwards, by the way, just to make the point, because I think Sharon made the Chokhmah Bina Da'at comment when we first started. No? Or Ellen did? Who did?
You did.
Did I imagine it? I thought somebody came in with that question about what the different terms... Anyway.
Oh, me. I asked Ruthie because I couldn't understand.
So, there's a long...
No.
She said Chokhmah.
No, she didn't say
Chabad.
She just said Binah.
So, there's a long history of this triumvirate, which sometimes are linked together as sort of a soup to nuts, A to Z, and they're not individual terms, but they're the sum total of smarts, whatever that means. And in some literatures and in moments, they are either discrete or they are a hierarchy. The place where they're most talked about, in my experience today, because of the neo-Hasidic world, is because of the role that they play in the Zohar, in classic Kabbalistic literature, that these three, Chokhmah, Bina, and Da'at, are the highest three sfirot, which is really interesting, by the way. A brief sermon, and then we'll come to the last piece of 17. Because the progression from knowledge to understanding, even though you can't have knowledge without some understanding, and they can't go together and so forth, I'm going to set aside Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah for a moment and give you Scott Meltzer, another rabbi that I like. That there's discrete, knowable things, and there's the understanding of them. Okay, and that's the progression from Da'at to Bina. And then for somebody who really gets it, right? That's what wisdom is. To truly be wise is not to be an outstanding researcher or teacher or author. It takes a whole lot of knowledge and understanding to be outstanding in those fields. But for me, wisdom is different. Wisdom is about knowing the unknowable, right? Wisdom is about getting it in a way that you can't communicate. You know how you can't talk to the next generation because they just don't get it? But live long enough and you get to see your children old enough to get it, right? And that's the wisdom thing. And Rolf was the one who for a long time just would love to quote it back to me, but I'm on the record. I don't believe you can be wise before the age of 65, right? You can't be a marathon runner until you run 26.2 miles. And I don't believe you can attain wisdom until you've done at least 65 laps around the sun. You can get it in all sorts of ways, but there's a certain longevity challenge. And by the way, making it 65 times around the sun doesn't mean that you are wise. It means that you qualify for Medicare, but it doesn't mean that you are necessarily wise. But it is a prerequisite, one of the prerequisites. You know, I've said it before, I don't think you can be wise without ever really stubbing your toe in this world, without really knowing pain. I think there's a whole bunch of prerequisites to wisdom. Now, having said that, the Zohar discusses them moving in the other direction. And this is really, really cool. That in the world above, in the world of the Ein Sof, there's no alphabet, there's no thought, there's no language, there's no temperature, there's no colors. It's not even like the ocean. It's not even like space. It's the perfect vacuum in all ways. There aren't even boundaries or borders. That's why it's called the Ein Sof, right? So when the possibility of thinking is created, that is the beginning of the Sfirot. There's no thinking, there's no alphabet, there's no words, there's no language. It's just like the ripple, the possibility of something different. That, when it condenses down into some form of a feeling, it's not even thought yet, because thoughts happen in language, right? But when the ripple itself exists, and then to be able to identify it, to look at it, and to say, oh my God, there's something different, but you can't say that because there's no language. That's understanding. And then when it makes the leap into language, into the alphabet, there are those who write that Bina is where lines begin, right? Because you can't have the alphabet until you can draw a line. So that's the being able to identify something different. And then da'at, knowledge, isn't the way we use it, the way I used it, but knowledge is really the alphabet in words. Because then once you have words, you can build anything, right? And that's the other seven steps to get to Malchut, to Yesod, and ultimately to creation. But that's really cool to think about all that's required before we even get to the possibility of what we would know of as learning something. So I love that. And then, through a specific Hasidic world, through Labav, that those highest three Sfirot, Chochmah, Bina, Da'at, Chibudah, become the Lubavitchers, their acronym in this world.
Really?
Which is really...
It's acronym for Chochmah Bina Da'at.
And you know what I love about that? And this comes, and I've been thinking more and more about this in the aftermath of reading Unorthodox, in the book discussion from Unorthodox, a very different Hasidic sect than Chabad. Very different Hasidic sect. There are people who don't like Chabad and have an anti-Chabad chip on their shoulder. I'm not one of them. I'm not a Chabadnik. Don't misunderstand me. I don't often send people to the Chabad house. It's not, but what I love about Chabad is two things. One is Chabad lives in a world, not the Orthodox world of judgmental, not the world of all or nothing. But if I could get you today to eat have a kosher lunch. If today, instead of your bacon cheeseburger, if you only eat fresh fruit, I don't know, whatever the example would be, or you come to the Chabad house, and if you just do one thing today that you did, it's a better world. Mm-hmm. It's a better world. One mitzvah makes it a better world. If I can get you to put on tefillin, it doesn't have understanding, it may have no, it may be a tourist moment, somebody takes your picture, but you put on tefillin. So as opposed to an Orthodox world that's us and them, Chabad only knows us, and Chabad loves that. And second, Chabad, better than any Hasidic school that I've engaged, either intellectual or experientially, remembers back to the 18th century and the stories of the Besht, where it's about joy and celebrating. They really do. And again, my in-laws used to get knocked on the door when Fratkin's son moved into Coronado, and their last name is Goldstein, and he would gain access into the shores in spite of all the good security they did not like. Goldsteins! Are you the Goldsteins? I'm Rabbi. I don't even remember his name. How wonderful. Yidden in Coronado. Would you come? So there's something about that makes us uncomfortable. To be outed when we don't want to be outed and whatever else is true. But there's something really lovely about it. And it's not... There's also fundraising. There is. But it's not because they want to get them on the donors list. They want to get them to keep kosher. And if it's only $1 million a month, they only come to... It's not such a... Again, there are questions and let's move on. All right, so did I see one hand pop up?
I'll tell you a funny Chabad story.
Is it quick? Or otherwise, save it till 12:30.
Okay.
15 minutes. That way we can
When
finish.
you go off, I'll tell you a funny Chabad.
All right, that way we can at least finish this one. Thank you for helping to keep me on track. That reminds me of wonderful David Hartman stories, too, about the issue of keeping on track. The last piece. Imein Kemach, Ein Torah. Imein Torah, Ein Kemach. All right. If there's no flour, there's no Torah. If there's no Torah, there's no flour. Yes, Suzanne?
After this is about an internet, it means the has to provide for the family, the sustenance. After that, the man is not listening to them further.
All right. So you have to be able to provide sustenance. I don't know why for your family, but I mean not just for your family, also for yourself.
And then the whole family.
Good.
And on the other hand, men must not lose that work alone.
Good. Outstanding. Both are true. Right? Those who starve to death learn very little Torah, and those who only eat learn very little Torah. So the good.
Why flour instead of bread?
Neat. I don't know, but neat question.
Why did he use that?
Why? Is that on Kova's question?
Yeah.
Yeah. I was making sure because we have a disjointed nature of our conversation.
Yeah. I want to offer. I mean, in answering that, you could have chosen. If you don't, keep a goods in the market, whatever. Because I think it's connected to some of the things we said before about the experiential sense of knowledge and the gaining of the being in this world. And I think this is one of the interesting ones as far as the rabbis go. You cannot I read it more in Torah. He doesn't talk about keeping the mitzvot or whatever. Torah in the very sense of being immersed in any kind of understanding, knowledge, whatever.
Nice.
You have to be of this world in order to aspire to the upper spheres. That's my reading.
Nice,
and that's
right?
why it's kemach and not just bread.
Torah not given to the angels. So you have to be of this world to be able to have Torah. And to be of this world, though, you also need to have Torah.
Today they would have said something but gluten-free.
Jackie, Louise.
Okay, well, to answer what someone said about being flour as opposed to bread, if you can make something that would provide sustenance out of flour, not necessarily bread.
Not one.
In order to be bread, you have to add something else to it. But you can make something that would be of a sustenance. In other words, you could survive just having flour and water.
I misunderstood your comment. So that it's in terms of it being elemental, like air.
That's a
Nice.
And also, if you can't fill your stomach with some kind of sustenance, it doesn't, whatever else is occupying you is not as meaningful.
Perfect.
So that Torah wouldn't be meaningful to you unless if you couldn't concentrate on it and not just be thinking about your empty stomach.
Outstanding. Nicely said, Jackie. Louise?
I don't think the word flour matters that much. It could be flour, it could be bread, it could be air, it could be milk, it could be water, it could be whatever it is. But I think the analogy is that it's life. And if you think of, you can just live any kind of a life, but if you have Torah, you lead an ethical life, you lead a moral life, you lead a life of goodness, of tzedakah.
Really? No, I'm serious.
No, because I know
knowing
people,
Torah or being in possession of Torah guarantees a moral life.
No, it gives us the guidelines for that.
Because don't forget, we started with proper behavior.
Neat. So we do have to make that tie. I assume that's where you're going, but don't make it. All right, finish what you say, Louise.
Go ahead.
No, because I got Koba first. Ellen's going to hold it for a second, but I want to make sure you were done. Louise.
Okay, yeah.
Having listened, I see flour is a basic element that you have to build from, or to get whatever other thing you want. Torah is the same thing. It comes to you, but you still have to build off of it.
Nice. Outstanding. And because I think we're going to go in a bit of a different direction, and I want to go there, but I just wanted, because I was in my mind for Jackie, and then you make the point too. It really is remarkable as flour, because if it said bread, the truth is, who eats that much bread anymore? Right? But it says flour, and even though I cut way back on my carbs, you cut back on your carbs, but all of a sudden it's bread, and it's bagels, and it's pita, and it's tortillas, and it's cake, and it's, we had good cheesecake last night. And flour all of a sudden as a staple, it's pasta, is as a staple, as the elemental, is so much more, even if they didn't have, I know they didn't have so many,
I'm totally in a different direction.
All right, so I want to get Ellen's different direction.
Okay.
I just want to make the point that there's something really neat about it being the element from which many different foods come. All right.
Okay, I had all those thoughts, but really, I think that it ties it together because Torah gives us how to get flour. Until we have Torah, we're eating manna. We don't know how to get flour.
What?
We don't, because it tells us how to have our fields, how to farm, how to do agriculture, how to leave the corners.
But it does. I mean,
it does.
It doesn't tell us the simple things. I mean, simple things.
It doesn't say how to grind
my
it,
Ohio roots. But it does. Torah does give the guidelines for how to farm. They're taken to be the mitzvot of the land of Israel, but having to do with whether it's things from the Shemitah year to not harvesting the corners, to having to do with gleaning, to having to do with all sorts of things, which is different than the what we would normally think of as the knowledge needed to farm, which is how do you water and how to do those sorts of things.
And it's not bread because then we couldn't have Pesach. But
it's okay. You say motzi in Pesach too, and motzi lechem
but it's okay. But the whole thing about Torah, you have to go back to the beginning of what he says, because if there's no flour, then there's no Torah. If there's no Torah, there's no proper behavior, and that's where the moral life comes in.
And I do want to end there. I don't know if Ruth is going to keep us there or not, but in terms of the circle of it.
I wanted to touch upon the circle and my comment when you were mentioning all the different things that you can make of kemach. I was going in the other direction, which is much closer to what Ellen said about what it takes to have the kemach from which you're making your lafa and your pita and your whatever. I'm thinking about the grain being sawed and all the work that goes into it, and the grinding, and becoming kemach. And the circle that it goes back to the beginning, those two things really make it into a beautiful poetic closure. The kemach's processing and the Torah and the derech eretz. Those are in the middle he's just, as far as I'm concerned, that's just a feeling.
See, I get the middle because of Abby.
Yeah.
But I get the middle.
I get the
But I get the middle because
she's
of Abby.
only interested in behaving right and eating.
And going back to that thing in about the 4 different types of children. This is all about that. How we learn, how far, and how much we put into teaching at what level. The whole thing about grad school, about preschool and elementary school and all the way through grad school and until you're 65.
So for those who have, as strongly encouraged, been journaling in general, which is highly recommended, and every Wednesday at 11 becomes a good opportunity for more fuel for the fire or ink for the pen or inspiration for the writer, that we'll decide when we finish chapter 3 in probably about 2 weeks what's going to be our writing assignment to see if we want to publish a few more or whatever else. But I would strongly encourage you, because I think this Mishnah stands out in its organizational principle, that we have 4 discrete pieces, and the ending overlaps with the beginning. Again, I'll keep simple observations, which is there. That it's a wonderful Mishnah to say, okay, so build a house out of it. Right? So now really go back. We've done the pieces and a little bit, and there are lots of different ways to do it. So, they're not fully fleshed out yet, but we get pieces of them here. I like the idea, as somebody, came from here. I had a phone appointment this morning on very functional things having to do with money. Not the synagogue's, not mine, but the Jewish communal funds. And in the midst of it, we're having a computer problem. So Abe Tallerman is here working with Debbie. So we're having see if you can hear that online. Think of that's Joe, if you can hear that. No, it's not why. So Abe is here working with Debbie. So I'm doing this phone call about the Parnasim, about the philanthropists in the community, and a couple of specific questions. And I'm getting interrupted for these questions about the network and about the wireless and about this and that because we need to do it. And then I come from here and I spend about 90 minutes, give or take, where it's sort of like Ki'ilu, we were with the angels, right? Not that it's not applied stuff, because we do a lot of applied stuff here, but this has got, I know that's the sanctuary, but this has wonderful sanctuary about it. We come in here and we talk and we spin and we dance in the words, and it's, and it's applied, but it's all in the head, right? Even though we eat a little bit and we do whatever else, and we talk about our children and our parents and our friends and so forth and ourselves, and then we leave from here, and many people go to lunch from here. It seems to be about the right time and so forth. But it's like from the regular world, as if we lived in a world that was only Torah, as if this is the Rashbi, the Shimon Bar Yochai reference, as if not every day, all day, but for 90 minutes we buried our bodies and we were just talking heads and living Torah, and then we go back into that world. And this Mishnah starts and says, remember, there can be no learning, no knowledge, no nothing, no Torah, period, if you don't act in the world the way you're supposed to act. And it ends it by saying, it's lunchtime. There also can be no learning or anything else if you don't worry about feeding, and it's not just your kemach, it's your family's kemach, and it's everybody's kemach, that everybody needs. So it's like the entry into the intellectual, for me, if I were going to journal tonight, it's about the entry into the intellectual experience, knowing that we are grounded, not punished, but we live in this world, right? And we can have the intellectual experience, and then we end it by reminding ourselves we are embodied, we are grounded, and then we come out of it, and they're not separate worlds, but we need to live in a world that's derech eretz and Torah, or we need to live in a world that's kemach and Torah, right? And different foci at different times. So I love. It's a beautiful, beautiful Mishnah in total. Correct. And people, as is true of our tradition in general, the more one studies the context and so forth, the more beautiful it gets. And we are a tradition that often atomizes things. And we've been doing this forever. But we take quotations, whether we are fair to the original context or unfair to the original context. We are a long tradition of doing that. And this is a Mishnah where there are places where pieces of it will get quoted, but the quotation itself, I think, is much lovelier when all four pieces are there. All right, let's read 317 again once all together, and then we will turn the page and prepare for next Wednesday. Together. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah Omer, Im ein Torah, ein derech eretz. Im ein derech eretz, ein Torah. Im ein chokhmah, ein yira. Im ein yira, ein chokhmah. Im ein bina, ein da'at. Im ein da'at, ein bina. Im ein kemah, ein Torah. Im ein Torah, ein kemah. And if you will turn the page to 318. And again, 318 is online, and I'll get 319 up online. 318 is 318 is a long one. I don't know that we will get through all of it next week, so I don't want to commit that we will be done with chapter 3 next week. But I imagine we should be able to be done before Pesach.
By Pesach, yeah.
For 318 and 319. All right, let's read 318 together. Hu haya omer. Kol shechochmato meruba mima'asav lema hu domeh le'ilan she'anafav merubin v'shorashav mu'atin v'haruach ba'a ve'okratu v'hofchatu al panav shene'emar v'haya ke'ar'ar be'arava v'lo yireh ki yavo tov v'shachan chadrerim bamidbar eretz melecha v'lo teshev. Aval kol shema'asav merubin mechochmato lema hu domeh le'ilan she'anafav mu'atin v'shorashav merubin she'afilu kol haruchot sheba'olam ba'ot v'noshvot bo ein mezizin oto min komo shene'emar v'haya ke'et shatul al mayim Ve'al yuval yishalach shorashav ve'lo yireh chi yavo chom ve'haya alehu ra'anan uvishnat batzoret lo yid'ad ve'lo yamish me'asot peri. So I actually think, as long as we're not late yet, and we have to be late by definition, I think the discussion of this, as long as the Mishnah will be relatively straightforward and hopefully wonderful. Let's go ahead and read 3:19, because it's short, but also relatively straightforward. It's not inconceivable to me.
18 or 19?
I'm sorry, 19, thank you. So the Hu Haya from 3:18 is Elazar ben Azariah in 3:17. And now we'll get a different fellow whose name looks quite similar, but let's read 3:19 just on the outside chance that we're overly productive next week. Together. Rabbi Eliezer ben Chisma Omer, Kinin ufitchei nida, hein gufei halachot, tikufot v'gimatriyot, parparaot la chochma.
Addendum to the former one? This one in itself is at least
2 weeks.
Exactly.
See you next week.
Have a good